Hi, today's June 5th, 2023, and I'm honored very much so to have Cindy Drukier with me. Cindy, tell us about your journey as auteur, filmmaker of The Unseen Crisis, and what is that?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Well, The Unseen Crisis is a film about people who are vaccine injured and what happened to them. Um, Sorry if there's some loud noise, some air conditioning just turned on. It'll probably level out in a minute. So I'm a journalist here at NTD Television. I also worked for Epoch Times for a number of years. And, of course, the last couple of years, the story has been COVID-19, all of the aspects about it. And when in early 2021, when stories started to come out about, people who are having very bad reactions to the vaccine, this of course is news, right? This should be covered. This is part of the story. And so I was covering it, but as most people know, it was pretty much ignored by almost all of the media. And not only ignored, people who try to post on social media about what happened to them, they were censored. And there was just this willful ignoring and abandonment by the health authorities, by everyone, of these people. And it became increasingly obvious that this wasn't changing, that this is unconscionable. We know that there isn't a medicine in the world that isn't bad for some people, right? That's why there's like warning labels on every single solitary thing in your medicine cabinet. And yet you weren't allowed to talk about people who had a bad reaction to this particular intervention, this particular medication, vaccine. And I felt that their stories, as I got to know more of the people, more of the stories, I just realized it needed to be told. It needed to be told in a way that would be a lot more accessible and intimate, and to really show people how their lives have been destroyed, devastated. Like there's some people in, wheelchairs with feeding tubes, and they're just trying, treatment, trying this, trying that, trying anything that maybe could help. Everything is out of pocket. They're not getting answers. And I wanted to show that.
Yeah, so I think that you can kind of hit a few notes for me that resonated. It's not just people. I think there's this dichotomy between statistics and people. A person can have something happen. It's not necessarily cause for the world to pay attention. If I cross the street, I get hit by a car. I mean, certainly that's sad, and it's hugely tragic, especially because it's me. But it may not be an actionable item that we should change traffic patterns. We should change sneakers. We should change eyeglasses, or any of those things. It may not just be something that happens. So, an individual circumstance is not necessarily a statistic, and the statistic, it seems to be, or sets of those seem to be the way on which we change policy. But the part that I think is, you maybe didn't underline adequately, and certainly you do in the movie, is that these are human beings, and so many of them are young. The ones, my late mother-in-law, she lived all through COVID-19. She died relatively recently, God rest her soul and all that, a few months ago. But we kind of nurtured her and carried her all through COVID-19. And she was willing always to take the next booster, as it were. And I'm a medical doctor, and that's certainly okay with me, because she had very little long-term future either way. And so the kind of the bargain she was making was that there would be potentially some benefit, and maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. And certainly insofar as there were benefits to this vaccine, they were for the elderly, who had far more risk from the initial SARS-CoV-2 than others. But I don't think she even wanted her grandkids and to be locked down, and or taking these vaccines at the same level, because they have far more long term. And I let me just show the screen capture for the movie here, The Unseen Crisis, and perhaps as we go through, we can show some of the actual individuals. It's an incredible thing. You can read about tremors, you can read about this and that, but perhaps you can talk about some of the individuals you spent time with for this movie, and how you chose them, and who were they, and how were they situated, and how do we know those problems they had were from vaccines per se?
Right. Okay. Lots there to talk about. Of course, there's, tens, hundreds, thousands. We don't know how many people vaccine injured, which is a whole other, conversation. And there's whole communities of people that have found each other because they're not getting help from elsewhere. And so I started to, as I met vaccine injured, I also, kind of met these communities and understood, who's out there. So I could have chosen unlimited people to be in the film. And actually, as you saw, I focus on 6 people who I'll talk to you about, but I also have this big Zoom call that comes back several times in the film. Mm-hmm. And the reason I have that is because I wanted to show people that, yeah, it's not just this 6 people. They're representative of something bigger. And the experiences they're having are consistent with all these other people as well. And I wanted to show too, the people I focused on are American, but the people in the Zoom call are from Canada, Australia, South Africa, UK, Canada. Did I say so? So that's one thing. So the people I chose, I wanted to get a representative sample of what seemed to be the population and the circumstances that people were in. So we have one girl, Maddie DeGarry. She was 12 years old and joined the Pfizer vaccine trial. And she, immediately after getting her second dose, within hours after getting her second dose, started to have symptoms. And, less than a day later, she was, hunched over, can't breathe, just they, had to rush her to emergency. It was clear to the parents this is a reaction to the vaccine. She had started to feel badly. She got it like 4 p.m. That night she slept with her parents, kind of thing that she said she never did because she was feeling well, but went to school. But, then things didn't go well. And by the end of the school day, she was, in a hospital. To this day, she is in a wheelchair with a feeding tube. Yeah. And this is crazy. This is, she got her second shot, early 2021, January 2021. And now we are, middle of 23 here. This is still what things look like for her. So she's one person. Another woman who's in a wheelchair as well was similar. She's got feeding tube. She has to have oxygen, is Nikki Holland. She is, a highly functioning physical therapist. She has her doctorate in physical therapy. She was teaching at a college. She's a mom of 3. And now she's confined to a wheelchair, still trying to raise her kids, still trying to take them to school and make their lunches. And so that's 2 people. Those were neurological reactions. They had a very similar constellation of reactions. Her too, she started having breathing problems. She went to work and saw her, home care patients as normal, but within 36 hours, she was, in a hospital on a ventilator and, completely hooked up to machines. Mm-hmm. So, one of the things you look at is the temporal, relationship between, having an intervention, having something, and did anything else change in the interim? These happened very quickly and it was pretty obvious, it was related to the vaccine to them. Another one, 2 other people who are in there, Madeline Johnson, young pre-med student, so a college student, super brilliant. School was never an issue for her. She was sailing her way to medical school. And her too, very quickly after the vaccine, started to get symptoms, started with a numbness in her hand and then numbness all the way up. Then her leg was paralyzed. And then she couldn't, it was burning in her throat. She couldn't, eat anything. And, it's just this constellation of symptoms are very consistent. So in each individual case, you might be like, oh, maybe there is a coincidence. Maybe it's something else, but the patterns are just too similar. Another one, Angela Woolbrook, she is a registered nurse in charge of a big unit at her hospital. And within 12 minutes of her shot, she, couldn't breathe. She was, sweating. She was like basically collapsed in her car. It was a drive-through one. And she got, immediate medical attention. And she said, because, everyone knew health was always, she's like a dancer, super fit, always healthy, never anything wrong. And she's like, because the medical team knew her very well, know she's a nurse, and it happened within 12 minutes, was very obviously, the shot. And all of these people, they go through Okay, so those are 4 cases had the neurological reactions. Then we have 2 cases with heart reactions. So one is a dad and his 16-year-old son died of myocarditis within 5 days of getting his vaccine. And it's one of these stories that we sadly keep hearing. Someone's young, athletic, in the middle of doing their
I think they call it. I think they call it suddenlyitis.
Exactly. And, it was so devastating because he's, a single dad devoted to his son. He didn't have a dad growing up. And anytime he saw like a dad and son,
It's the most tragic thing.
it's so tragic. And he was like, I'm going to be the best dad ever. And he was so careful with, his son. He got the shot first, to test it out. He didn't have any reactions. They all felt confident and safe. Pfizer said it was safe for teenagers. His son got the shot, and 5 days later, and he's just, it was his whole life. His son was everything to him, It's
Absolutely.
just devastating. And then Bob Snow, an airline pilot, 31 years with American Airlines or various airlines. And he too, they monitor the health and the heart specifically of pilots very closely. So he's constantly getting heart checkups, never had any issue at all. And then this was a couple months after he got his vaccine, but he had started to have some weird pains and different things that he thought it was actually gastro, because earlier in his life, he had some stomach issues. That's what he thought it was. He went to the doctor. He was getting this stuff checked out. But then 6 minutes after landing, he went into cardiac arrest. And I asked him, what had happened if it had happened 10 minutes earlier? You're still in the air. And he's like, we wouldn't be having this conversation. He, was very lucky because there were people on the plane who could immediately, come to his aid, and a plane nearby happened to have some paramedics at it. So they got to him very quickly. And, obviously he lives to tell the tale, but it's frightening to imagine. Earlier I had, not in the film, but I had interviewed an agricultural pilot who's alone in his small plane, and he blacked out while flying. He knew he was in trouble, and he was like, had to, land wherever he could. And he doesn't even remember landing. Yeah. Somehow he did.
No, they're incredible stories. I just, I was scanning the film, and this is Mr. Ramirez's son, I believe.
Yeah.
And he's in the movie. I think here he is, Justice for Ernesto. He's wearing the shirt. Tragic story. I'd like to kind of focus on this aspect just for a moment, because as a physician, we treat kind of molecularly. I don't mean that in the literal sense. My treatment, I've seen thousands of patients over decades, and everybody's an individual. Everyone's unique. And when somebody has something, you can't necessarily generalize to the population. This is what I was kind of speaking to earlier, between people and statistics. Actually, there's kind of a terrible, horrible quote you might appreciate. I think Stalin said, one death is a tragedy. 100,000 deaths is a statistic. So they use that to their, people get numb by hearing the vast numbers. So I think in a sense, you've kind of de-Stalinized this aspect. You've brought the tragedy to the fore, and I applaud you for that. But I kind of want to isolate on the myocarditis in young people aspect, because, there are many other things that can happen. And as people get older, it's hard to divine or discern or dissect, hopefully not literally, what somebody's problem is if he's old enough to have had that problem organically, and so forth. But teenagers, teenage boys were not dropping dead, and they weren't getting myocarditis. And this is I think, the very true discernible signal that came from Israel fairly early on, that young men were having myocarditis at a rate vastly higher than ever before. And it's not an enormous signal. I think it's 1 out of 20,000 young men who got the vaccine who came up with myocarditis. And just to elucidate for our audience, myocarditis is not necessarily always sudden death, but there's like a 50% mortality within 5 years from it. So if you have a severe case, yes, it can be deadly. But even if not, there are severe ramifications and curtailments. And that plays out against, what we've kind of hinted at earlier, which is that the risk from the illness itself was necessarily, almost nil. I think Israel just came out with another stat that in the age group 18 to 49 young men without any medications or comorbidities, there were a total in the entire country of 0 deaths from SARS-CoV-2. So the risk part from the virus was nil, and even if the risk from the vaccine was slightly less than that or more than that, it was still pointless. That we kept hearing all these things like, oh, unless we're all vaccinated, nobody's vaccine matters. This is kind of like the umbrella raincoat theory that you're going to get wet. With your raincoat and galoshes and umbrella, you're going to get wet if I don't put on my raincoat and galoshes and umbrella. And that was all absurd. So, I kind of want to, hone in on that one. That, has there been any, I imagine that you're getting a little bit of crickets sound, an absence of response from your movie because it's so potent. Is there a place where people can kind of, find out the data on myocarditis, and what has been the response from these, theoretically regulatory organizations, FDA, CDC, and so forth, from your film and from this aspect in particular?
Well, first of all, the response, I did reach out to all of the, expected agencies to give comment on the film. Only the CDC responded to me with, a bunch of canned answers, basically. The myocarditis is actually one of the, potential risks that is admitted to by the CDC, FDA. That's one of the 4 things that they say can possibly happen to you. So there's anaphylactic reaction, myocarditis, some blood clotting, and Guillain-Barré. To date, those are the only 4 that they acknowledge. So at least there's that, which is unlike, the neurological stuff, which according to Dr. Paul Merrick is 80% of the reactions. Mm-hmm. But back to the myocarditis. In terms of stats, I'm not sure the best source. I would guess that the Vaccine Safety Research Foundation, BSRF, which is Steve Kirsch's organization, they're very good at compiling all of these things. So I would guess that's probably a good place to go. I can't direct you exactly. Yeah, it's certainly, even in the film, there's someone, a 6-year-old boy, who got myocarditis. And to the point about, we don't know, whatever the death rate is, we don't really know, because we saw in that case, whether some things are getting attributed to the vaccine, whether it's even getting recorded that the, someone who died of something got the vaccine. I don't think those stats are being collected. Yeah, so plus then as things get further out, it's further out from getting the vaccine, it's going to be easier to explain away or say, we don't know, or that kind of thing. Or there's also the, explanation, which, the literature discredits, according to Dr. Peter McCullough, who says this in the film, that, it's a spike, it's the COVID-19 that's inducing this, not necessarily the vaccine. But apparently, according to literature, that's not the case. So I think if for the people that want to deny all these things are going on, they can pile up their, their statistics and what they want to look at. And for the people who say there's something terrible going on, there's a very big pile of things to point at as well. And there's this, I think a lot of people are looking for their own confirmation bias, regardless of what they hear. So I haven't had any, aside from YouTube instantly taking down the trailer for this film, it has been crickets. I haven't heard anything. I
think what they wanted to do was be true to your film's title. They wanted to literally be unseen. Yeah. How could it be an unseen crisis if they let people see it?
Exactly. Exactly. And actually, another thing to note, just that I learned in talking to Dr. Peter McCullough about the myocarditis, is that and there's two times that you're more likely to see the collapsing happen, and that's when there's a surge of adrenaline, right? So that's when doing sports. That's why we're seeing all these sports figure collapse on the field. But the other one is in the normal waking cycle. Apparently there's a surge of adrenaline between 3 and 6 a.m. And in the film, there's another dad whose son died of myocarditis. And it's a hockey dad. He got the shot to play hockey, but he actually died in his sleep. Or he was found dead on the floor beside it. Obviously, there's something happened because he was found dead on the floor beside his bed in the morning.
Yeah, I don't know if you have you seen the FIFA database? So for Americans, FIFA is that other football. They call it Federation Internationale Football, whatever. And so it's basically football. And there are, I think fewer than 100,000 members, but basically they are soccer pros, teachers. They're very, they're high level soccer players, obviously hugely fit to be running around, because on, baseball and even football, there's a lot more standing around. Soccer is pretty much nonstop action. And so these are potentially the most fit humans on the planet, or, top 1%. And the death rate amongst FIFA members skyrocketed, not from COVID, but at the coincidence of the rollout of the injections. Have you seen that, or?
I haven't actually. I'm super interested now that you mention it. And are they attributing it to the vaccine? Is this
data? This is one of those things. It's the unseen crisis. It's the unseen.
But is this data they normally publish, or is it a special occasion they're letting us know this anomaly?
Well, I'm gonna let people use their Google fingers for this. Okay. But I think this is fairly well documented. There's no pun intended. There have been huge spikes. Something that has interested me, and I'm not really looking for an answer here, I apologize, but it's just something that perked up in my mind, along the way, not just today, but, why was there never a vaccine to the SARS-CoV-1? like World War I, it wasn't called that. It was called the Great War at the time. So SARS was just called SARS in 2003. And there were attempts, mind you, in China and elsewhere to make a SARS vaccine. And I'm going to put this out to listeners. They can look, kind of go through the same paper trail or pixel trail that I've been doing, laying out. And there may be an article in here for me, but why was there never a vaccine? Nobody really asks this, but to answer is that there were issues with making a SARS vaccine, and there's a thing called ADE, antibody dependent enhancement, which was kind of putting a wrench, or as the British say, a spanner in the works, and clogging things up, no pun intended, coagulating, because the spike protein had activity when re-injected in potentially people who had other coronaviruses. And just as a slight preface, coronavirus, young people don't know this, and maybe old people don't know this either, but coronavirus has always been, as long as humans have been around, is the second most common named cause of the common cold. So the first most common cause of the common cold is unknown, okay? But the first named cause is adenovirus. People have probably heard of that. That's the virion that is used as a shell to make the flu shots every year. And then comes coronavirus. So coronaviruses have always been around. And there's probably a lot of people, everyone's experienced, if you're more than like 2 days old, you've probably experienced coronavirus on some level. And so the ADE, this antibody-dependent enhancement, since all coronaviruses have spike protein, is it basically you're engaging a virion fraction, segment, an epitope they're called, the spike protein, to somebody who's already experienced it, whether they've had SARS or SARS-CoV-2 or whatever, or alpha, beta, delta, gamma, whatever it is. Everybody on Earth has had coronavirus on some level, shape, manner, and form. And I think the difficulty with making the original SARS vaccine between 2003, they had, theoretically, 16 years before 2019, and they tried, they banged their head against the wall, is that people were having reactions. They were having worse problems, antibody-dependent enhancement. So that is sort of what it sounds like. They were getting super reactions, a little bit the way rheumatic fever results from strep throat. You get an overreaction to the initial, virion, or initial causation. Strep is a bacterium, but anyway. So, basically you're kind of irritating a system that's already primed and prepped to see that thing, coronavirus. And again, so that's my diatribe. I apologize for that. But, what I think was always missed here is that there were potential issues. And I think it's really, the things I'm trying to look at are a little bit Sherlock Holmesian. I forget the name of the story, but there's the dog that didn't bark in the night is a piece of something that really stuck with me from my early adolescence. I was an avid Sherlock Holmes reader, and there's one story where Holmes figures it out because the dog didn't bark at night, and then was like, well, what does that mean? He says, well, there was a dog and there was an intruder and the dog didn't bark. And it sounds obvious when you think about it. Well, obviously the dog knew the intruder, but people don't see that as when something doesn't happen, they don't see it as a fact. So there are these vacuoles, these negative facts that I think were really evident throughout SARS, this COVID-19 overreaction. And I think one of them is the fact that nobody brought up the fact that they had not made a SARS vaccine to original SARS. And what was up with that? There were some issues. Nobody talked about those issues, and nobody talked about the potential dangers of the vaccine as a rollout. And coincident, they kind of made this into a tornado mixed in with an earthquake. The Latin expression is, French expression is force majeure. They made it into something that's in your insurance policies where they won't cover tornadoes and earthquakes because that's something that's greater than all our perceptions. I think they whipped it into that when it needn't have been that. And again, just to finish my diatribe, there were reasonable data from the Diamond Princess, which was the perfect quarantine experiment, which you would have had to pay billions and billions of dollars to have if you had thought of it in advance, but it was there off the coast of Japan and showing nobody dying. And Fauci et al., looked at China's fictitious, fallacious data, as it were, and went with that kind of level of, zombie apocalypse versus the actuality that it was maybe a bad flu-ish kind of thing. And so, there's another expression, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. If you, don't look at the real data and you find these other things and you have an idea and I think I forget who it is, I think Hillel said, God, man plans and God laughs. There's this thing where it seems to me as if, and I'm not a conspiracy guy, but it seems as if they had pretty much everything all percolated and sussed out and divined in their own minds about how things should go. They're going to hold the population down and roll out a vaccine, not just a vaccine, but a novel formulation of a vaccine, an mRNA type vaccine, as opposed to the good old standard flu shots. And the Johnson & Johnson made the good old standard flu shot version of COVID, I think with far fewer issues. So here's my question. And I apologize for all that, but my question is, were the people in your film, were they vaccinated and or boosted with one particular type of vaccine? Did you see it with other ones? And there have been other vaccines. Obviously, we haven't experienced Sinovac and Covaxin and that stuff here from Russia and India, China and whatnot. So amongst the ones we had, were they mRNA vaccine recipients?
So all of them were, except the pilot. He got Johnson & Johnson. And Brianne Dressen, who started COVID React 19, who's towards the end of the film, she was in the AstraZeneca trial. But AstraZeneca was also mRNA too.
Yes. Yeah, they all were except Johnson & Johnson here. Yeah. Around the world, there were these other ones. There was a Sputnik from Russia, Covaxin from India, Sinovac from China, which basically just took freeze-dried coronavirus particles in toto. And they weren't isolating spike protein per se. They're supposedly less effective, but they also had fewer side effects.
I want to say something about one of the things you were talking about. One of the things that always struck me is that from the very beginning, okay, in theory, we don't know if we can create this vaccine, right? We tried, like you said, with SARS-CoV-1, and they gave up on it. And somehow that virus disappeared too, which is also interesting. But anyway, somehow, despite, from the very beginning, there was this confidence that they would come up with a vaccine that worked, right? All of the eggs were put in that basket. They weren't looking into, preventative treatment or early treatment. They put no energy, no money into that whatsoever. And we're going to lock you down until there's a vaccine, then life can go back to normal. So all the eggs they were convinced that they would come up with something successful, but in theory, there should have been no assurance that that would be the
Right.
outcome.
No, you're absolutely right about that.
Very interesting.
Yeah, no, I like to remind people that if that paradigm had been used for HIV, people would still be hunkered down, waiting for the vaccine. Therapeutics are the sole manner, aside from prevention, obviously, prophylaxis, no pun intended, against HIV. And here we are, 40 years, if my math is right, into the HIV problem, and there's no vaccine. There may be never a vaccine for HIV. And to assume this, and I think the sad, macabre aspect of it is that people were essentially, to use herd immunity analogy, they were herded into silos to wait, or corrals to wait for the vaccine. With every other infection, there's the natural immunity that occurs through natural concourse, and your ballast, your strong parts of your population are the young and the healthy, and there's literally a 10,000 or more gradient of risk between like a 7-year-old and a 70-year-old.
And it was all the same.
And an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old and a 9-year-old and a 90-year-old. And 45% of the deaths worldwide, I believe, or at least in the US in particular, but all the industrialized countries, 45% of those deaths are in nursing home quality or lack of quality life. And again, I value that. We kept my mother-in-law in our basement. She would have left if she wanted, for the duration, and she lived healthfully and healthily throughout. But there's no reason to treat her as an example for a 9-year-old. It's absurd, and nobody's ever done that. Nobody's ever done one size fits all. I think Mao tried it in the Cultural Revolution. Maybe the Khmer Rouge tried to duplicate it, but one size fits all is a draconian absurdity, and to blind yourself as physicians. And I blame the medical establishment and doctors, organically and individually, for following along and treating everybody as if they were a 90-year-old. This is a craziness, and I think I hate to see heads roll because I'm not a guillotine kind of guy, but there has to be some kind of accounting for this. Yeah,
and also there's if you look back at the pandemic, planning that was in play, the pandemic, emergency plans that are in place before anything actually happens. You never lock down healthy people. That's not a thing. The masks.
Well, actually, there is a place in the time to lock down healthy people. It's called prison. If they've committed crimes, they happen to be healthy and they're criminals. So Jeffrey Dahmer might very well have been healthy, especially given his all meat diet. But you do want to lock him down before you use maybe.
Well, there we go. Everyone was criminalized who didn't want to be locked down. So maybe.
I know. So this was the criminalization of the population. This is again getting back to like Stalin and Mao and Khmer Rouge and so forth. The kind of effortless, what's the word? A dehumanization of your population. This was, endemic. People always want to know, like, how could Hitler have taken power? How come so many people have followed, these absurdities and so forth? But a lot of the essence of Hitlerian Germany was using the public health apparatus to what's the word for demonize a certain subsegment, Jews, for instance, and in particular in majority. And they were public health aspects of the de-Judification of society, because they were spreading disease. They were a disease themselves. They were sociologically a disease. All this kind of stuff. And you can see that this kind of it's an easy and slippery slope upon which to slide when we saw this for the unvaxxed. This is kind of the same duality of the clean and unclean. And Jeffrey Tucker wrote an excellent article on this in the Epoch Times, by the way, on this topic, which I commend people to read. And so I think this is something that speaks deeply to our, animal brain about how to stay clean. This is, something that a way of tweaking our psyches in a not a good way.
Yeah, and it was remarkable how easy it was to convince people of this. That was a thing that's, one of the most astounding things about the last couple of years is how easily vast proportions of the population were convinced that this was necessary. And the messaging also, which was purposely put out there without any scientific basis, that, you need to do it to protect others, but they never tested for transmission. And in fact, it obviously did not stop transmission. But they were telling all of us that, you need to get the vaccine to protect grandma, to protect others. And it was false from the very beginning, and they knew that. And I bring this out in the film as a way to, help people understand, because there's different ways to explain everything that happened. It was an emergency time of crisis. People had the best intentions and did their best, and they didn't have full information. This is what happened. And maybe some of it can be explained that way. But when they're purposely manipulating the population into thinking certain things, and they did tests, what would be the most effective messaging to get people to take the vaccine, focus groups. There was a nudge unit in the UK, part of the UK government to nudge people's,
it's more than nudging. It's kind of
exactly
back to the herd thing. It's a lot of it's corralling. It's like, how do you get the cows into the abattoir?
They figured out exactly what was going to be the most effective messaging to manipulate people. And also back to the, how did we get into this mode when none of the, pre-pandemic planning documents, suggested what we did? I always think it started in China, and obviously China's knee-jerk reaction is going to be totalitarian, one size fits all, as, draconian as you can imagine, right? Mm-hmm. And it seemed like everyone's like, oh, okay, that's how we deal with this crisis. Okay, let's adopt it.
Yeah, that's the real issue. I just wrote an article in Brownstone called, but it's called The Marvelous Mr. McNeil. And it's about Donald McNeil, the erstwhile chief science writer, global health expert in the New York Times. And he wrote an article in late January. It was published early February 2016. 2020, on coronavirus, before there had been a single case in New York City, by the way, a month and a half, and it was Go Medieval on it. And he boasts, that he has the ears of the top public health experts on earth, or in the US at the very least. And he kind of humble brags that Dr. Fauci was one of the 8 experts in on the call. And he wasn't sure whether he should push this article, because his feeling was, based on the China stuff going on, that we had to, quote unquote, go medieval on it. Well, what is go medieval? Well, the Black Death was medieval. That's when it occurred. And getting back to the Jews, at one point the Jews were blamed. Why not? for the Black Death, and at certain times hoarded into synagogues and have the entire synagogue set on fire with the doors locked from the outside. That didn't quite cure the Black Death, maybe caused a little bit of potential secondary. Anyway, I don't want to get too noirish here, but go medieval is not necessarily your best approach towards public health, infectious disease.
That's like the enlightened approach to things.
Yeah, it's an absurdity, but the idea is that go. And this kind of, I think this reflects more and poorly more on Mr. McNeil and kind of the mental, ethos they had, which was not one. And we see this over and over again. All the people who want to, quote unquote, save democracy, they don't necessarily like the bipartite, at the very least, aspect of democracy, wherein there are multiple voices. And the idea is to crush those voices and to have yours be, yours supersede those, and have really essentially more fascistic, totalitarian aspect where you have control. And I think, the only good news there's certain aspects of good news that came from COVID-19, but they're not really good news. There are silver linings within the dark cloud, but there are dark clouds within those silver linings as well, which is that we saw that parliamentary democracy is fragile. You see the tyranny of the majority when one party has complete control without kind of any factionalism. So in New Zealand, we see these as happy places. Everyone wants to leave the U.S. for potential nuclear apocalypse to go to New Zealand, and New Zealand was a horrible, horrible place. And Australia pretty much ditto, of locking down their populace with even vastly more degrees than did the U.S. And that U.S. is bad enough. And Canada, I think, was worse than the U.S. Along the same lines. Here we at least had some kind of federalism aspect where states could kind of come up with the different answers and presumably the better answers, as we saw from, for instance, Florida, Texas, and whatnot. Anyway, so that wasn't a question either. So let me just kind of segue to you and the movie. Who's seeing the movie? How many people are seeing the movie? And what do you think about what happened with Twitter and What is a Woman, the action, reaction, and then replacement? I don't know if you followed that kerfuffle.
Yeah, I did. That was interesting. Well, okay, so currently you can see the film on Epoch TV. So if you're a subscriber, you can watch it. And if you're not, there's a deal for $4. You can see the film and get full access to everything for 4 weeks. So we have, last I checked, almost getting towards 500,000 views on Epoch TV. So that's pretty good. There are some pirated versions here and there, which may have been taken down by now. So I don't know about those ones. But yeah, about 500,000 views so far. Yeah, it's funny. After the What a Woman thing, I was like, should we put it for 24 hours on Twitter and see what happens?
I recommend.
Talk to the marketing crew and see what they think about that. So obviously a lot of buzz,
Yeah, when it gets taken down. I mean, getting taken down by Google, YouTube is a thing. But, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm with like Oscar Wilde in this. There's no such thing as bad publicity. It's like he actually said the only thing worse than people talking about you is people not talking about you.
Right, exactly. So yeah, obviously everyone has heard about that, whether they would have heard. And I saw a bunch of comments too saying, I wasn't going to bother looking at this film, but now after all this, I watched it. Wow, it was great, et cetera, et cetera. My hope is with this film to, burst through the echo chamber a little bit. I feel like, I purposely, there's nothing in there that's like tinfoil hat or conspiracy. Everything is like documented, mostly government documents, Pfizer documents, these people's personal stories, which are, completely, just explaining what going to their home, seeing how they're living. So there's nothing exaggerated or, unknown there. And, just kind of bring people through the process of how things happened. Like there's nothing that's, too many steps too far. And, one of the things that's come out through conversations is that a good community for this, to see this film, would be doctors, because a lot of people, as it comes out in the film, a lot of doctors see with their own eyes that there's something going on. They have patients or there's patterns going in the hospital, but they haven't been willing to admit it and talk about it because the people that do are vilified, their licenses threatened, they're fired, et cetera, et cetera. But there's got to be a lot of doctors out there, and I've heard there are, who know something's going on. So maybe this can help give them more information, more bravery, more something, and the critical mass can come out and say, yeah, there is something going on here.
Right. Yeah, no, I wish that were the case. I think that what we've seen is, kind of the march through the institutions, and the institutions have become corrupted, and people are acting as sheeple. They're acting, in a group. They don't want to have their heads stuck out and be whack-a-mole. So, there's also this joke about how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is only one, but the light bulb has to really, really want to be changed. So there, you need a receptivity that I think was there in say, classical Marcus Welby medicine from our idealized past. But I have not seen it that much in our current. And I've had my own dealings with the medical board and whatnot. I'm not an alpha male, not a beta. It turns out I'm a sigma male. Since we're in the Greek letter phase of our civilization, with the variants of concern, alpha, beta, gamma, they kind of skip delta, etc.
Chi too.
they skip chi so they could go right forward, which I think was hilarious. It's actually Chi for the Greeks, but G for the Chinese. That's its own story. It's an incredible thing. And frankly, that somewhat coincides with the fact we don't call it the Wuhan virus, like everything else. I mean, back in the day, we called the flus, Shanghai flu, the Hong Kong flu, etc. At any rate, I'm kind of rambling there. I apologize, but I kind of lose hope for, when people kind of see the green light that they can feel a certain way, then they will, and that's sad. I bring up this one medical anecdote at the risk of my quasi friendship with the individual, but I leave him unnamed. But I had this conversation with a friend of mine who is a physician, was seeing patients, and he got COVID early on, and he's a healthy guy. He plays a lot of sports, blah, 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 no smoking, et cetera, fit. And he was in his early 50s at the time. And so I was like, wow, I see him on the streets, like, what was that like? Oh, kind of bad cold kind of thing. Fine. Okay. His wife had it as well, went through the household. Everybody kind of, sniffles, Kleenex, achiness, better in a couple days. Fine. I said, wow, that's great. So you can kind of stop wearing a mask now at work, for instance. So, oh, no, I can't do that. I said, why? Just, put a little button says, I've had this already. And this is because he's dealing with kids. He's a pediatrician. And I said, wouldn't it be awesome to let the kids know there's light at the end of the tunnel? They can survive this. And he says, no, everyone's going to. I said, but you, so give me the rationale. Do you think you can get it again? He says, no. I said, do you think you can give it to anybody else after you're recovered? No. Do you think you have full immunity? Yes. You think, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the right answers medically, rationally. I said, so what would be your reason for not letting people lighten up a little bit? He says, it's not the time yet. I said, where's the clock? I mean, who's ringing the bells? He said, well, and long story short, basically like Nancy Pelosi. It's not the right time. There's still a lot of maneuvering to do to get that bleep hole out of the White House. And so this is where we are, where everything's kind of been politicized, up and down. And, this old parable, turtles all the way down. It's actually turtles all the way up as well. And people are turtles, and they kind of have a reptilian brain, or maybe it's an amphibian. I don't know which one turtle is. I think they're reptiles. Anyway, and they're going to be hiding within their shell thereafter, and they have a big protective shell all the way up. And so when the quasi revolution happens, or the Reformation, whatever you want to call it, then maybe people will come out from their shells and do it. A Mendelian truth and reconciliation, something like that. But I don't necessarily hold up huge hopes for that. But I do want people to watch your film, because I did, and I loved it. It had been an unseen crisis movie for me. I had not seen it, and I thought I'll just give you my quick review. I as a kind of science guy, I try to divide out individuals from the illnesses, because you can't let a story kind of sway your mind. But I think that you picked out an excellent kind of cross section of the problem, and you focused on people with, I think, really difficult to deny temporal association. So it happened immediately thereafter, and so forth. And these are tragic stories, and these are illnesses that are so rare and odd for that age group otherwise. And the stories are heartbreaking. They're heart-wrenching, and people, I think, have, I think that the anti-Stalinist moment in life is to realize that others have the same kind of emotion set and prospects as oneself. And your movie does that in a way that no statistic can. So I think that people on either side of this divide should watch it and then try to look at the stats, and it will give them a kind of a heartened, no pun intended, view of ways of dealing with this going forward and backwards.
Yeah, and I mean, there are stats. There's a couple things I want to highlight, actually. Part of the tragedy of it not being recognized, of it being an unseen crisis, is how these people are treated once they interact with the medical system, right? So these people with these, as you describe, these strange, not the myocarditis ones, but the other ones have these strange neurological symptoms, which are, there's a pattern of them. But when they go to the emergency room and the doctors are unfamiliar with seeing this, and they order the tests that seem to them to be the right tests, and they come back negative, and then they send these people home with a diagnosis of psychosis, functional neurological disorder. Basically, it's all in your head. And to me, that was like one of the most like heart-wrenching things, because this stays on their permanent record, right? Mm-hmm. So it stays on their permanent record. And so when they go to the emergency room the next time, maybe it's the same day or a day or two later, whatever, they see the crazy diagnosis in their charts and they treat them like a crazy person. So in one of those cases in the film, the mom of the girl, she's describing how, one night her stomach just ballooned out, and, they went to the local hospital to emergency, and they saw the crazy diagnosis in her charts, and then they treated her like a crazy person. You know what actually happened, why her stomach ballooned up? And this is like telling from so many angles. She couldn't eat, right? So she was eating with formula. What she was being fed was the formula that was recalled. Right. So she had a bad reaction to that. And that's why, but here's the irony. What, a couple babies, I can't remember how many died, and that all of that was recalled. And yet the vaccine is still being pushed when, there's way more adverse reactions, than that formula. And she was a victim of that too. And that was just like crushing, to kind of hear about.
It's horrible. It's horrible. I think people don't realize, that everyone who wants to follow the science, all that kind of stuff, don't realize how malleable science and science is not malleable, but scientists and those who report on it are. And, we see it a lot now. I mean, we can apply disease, obesity used to be a problem, and I'm not trying to minimize it as a problem, but it wasn't necessarily a disease. We can, make obesity a disease. We can make narcotic usage into a disease. All these kind of behavioral aspects, but certain things that come up as diseases, we can conversely shunt into behavioral aspects. And these things are not done necessarily at the again, molecular individual level between the physician and the doctor, but oftentimes, by pushes from the public health establishment and whatnot. Anyway, so we're going to close out the hour. I'd like to give you a final word before I have my final word.
Well, I just encourage people to go see The Unseen Crisis at unseencrisis.com. And yeah, I would say try, if you're convinced all this is already happening, but there's people in your life who are not, I would say try to watch it with them and see if you can have a healthy conversation, if they can be swayed by these people's stories, and maybe think that there's more than one perspective on this whole crisis.
Absolutely. So I'm going to add one comment, which I thought was really pithy from the movie. Dr. Peter McCullough mentions that the FDA, was involved in the production of the vaccine, and the FDA is the regulatory agency. And that's kind of like the, the referees playing the game. And how are they supposed to be able to be reasonable judges bureaucratically if they're part of the process? I also think there's huge amounts of regulatory capture, which partially we've seen, detailed in that Pfizer / Project Veritas video, which seems to have become unseen as well. People should go read 1984, because this is replaying of we have lots of dangers in our system, and we have to figure out ways to keep our freedoms and whatnot. So I want to just again show people the movie, and this is at the URL you can see up here is unseencrisis.com. I recommend you do this admonition right here. Watch now. If you can't watch it now, watch it later. And as a shameless self-promotion, I want to bring up my own efforts on pandemia and the panics. This is a book called Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. Here it is. It's got a picture of me on it. And people forget what Zika was. It's a virus. It's a genuine virus It's a dengue-like virus. There are four. I like to tell people I bring my props with me. This is one of my props. There are four dengue strains, and then there's this little one over here, the fifth dengue strain, which never was called that because it doesn't cause any actual human illness. So it's a real virus. It just doesn't happen to be a human one. It might be for other primates from Africa. Throughout the decades of its being known in Africa, it never caused microcephaly. Dengue, the other four strains, never caused microcephaly throughout Brazil over decades and millions of cases of dengue, never any blip in microcephaly. There was kind of a coincidence of maybe some extra cases of microcephaly in Recife, aka Recife, Brazil, in the Northeast, by neuropediatricians in 2015, and there had been a hunt for a new virus in 2014 and beyond, totally separately, by certain physicians who wanted a new virus to be there. Why? Because they wanted to do equity. They thought the Northeast, North Brazil was poorer, darker skinned, less industry, blah, 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 less attention from the federal government in Brazil. And they thought if they had a new virus, they could flip all that. So they were hunting for chikungunya, which is another African virus, never been seen in the Americas. And lo and behold, they couldn't find it. And somebody else came up, decided there was Zika, very flimsy evidence, blah, blah, blah. And then so for somebody for part one, happened to be in part two, and Recife, and said, oh, this is new, that's new, this caused that one, and they were off to the races. There were no Zika tests at the time anywhere in Brazil or anywhere on Earth because Zika has never caused human illness. There's a huge kind of crossover between dengue. It's got lots of the same actors. Dr. Fauci was involved even by the time that in the succeeding year, 2016, there were no cases of microcephaly showing up over baseline. Microcephaly is a real thing, but over baseline, there were no excess microcephaly cases. That was known in 2016. And again, a little bit like what he did with the ignoring the dying princess, he ignored that to push a $1 billion bill through Congress to get the Zika vaccine kind of thing mobilized. And there has not been a Zika vaccine. There is a dengue vaccine, and it caused problems. It caused the same antibody-dependent enhancement issue that we mentioned with the SARS vaccine. So this is kind of a cross-vaccine issue. And there was a Philippines kind of rejection of the Dengvaxia, the dengue vaccine. Anyway, so without going too far into that, it was pushed nonetheless. He actually borrowed from Peter to pay Paul. He announced proudly he was taking money from cancer, diabetes, all these other CDC, NIH kind of ventures to go push Zika anyway, because he wanted to put the onus on Congress that they weren't going to get their money for diabetes and whatnot because he's already spent it. So he actually, bureaucratically, he acted against the will of the people. Anyway, so Congress caved once the Planned Parenthood aspects could be filtered out. They poured $1 billion into this. And now we have a Zika industry, and nobody within the Zika microcephaly research world has announced, that there's been no microcephaly anywhere on Earth as a result of Zika ever since. Once they developed Zika testing, and once they developed firm standards for microcephaly, they haven't found anywhere on Earth, even in Northeast Brazil, where it supposedly happened in the first time. That succeeding year, every year since then, there's been none. And yet they're promoting and pushing a vaccine to come out. And once it's out, it will follow the same pathway, I think, through regulatory capture. There's going to be some benefit for the regulators, and there's going to be some benefit for the pharmaceutical companies, and there will be billions of doses throughout the tropics of Zika vaccine to be promoted and whatnot, probably at some risk given the dengue issue, through the population, and then they'll declare victory. That's my quote unquote conspiracy theory, but I don't think it is much of a conspiracy theory. Anyway, so I'm going to close with that. People can buy my book. Here it is again. It helps support these video casts. So if you like it, please share this. And thank you so much, Cindy Drukier. And I again apologize for making you listen to all my screeds.
Very interesting screeds. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to call it a day. You and I can chat for a minute, but we're saying bye to everybody else.